A little bit about our speaker today. Faith is a senior graduating this semester, studying humanities with an emphasis in art history. She loves the wide variety of subjects and ideas that the humanities entails and is passionate about trying to build bridges to the art world and demonstrate how art can teach and inspire us. She will gladly rewatch and recommend When Harry Met Sally. I don't know what that is.
Like the best movie ever, dude.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what it is, I guess. Any opportunity and can almost always be found grooving along to her 70s music playlist.
Today, I'm gonna talk a little bit about imitation in art. It's kind of a big subject, but I'm hoping we can kind of breach the surface a little bit. So over 4,000 years ago, an Egyptian scribe named Kakhat-Per-Semb, and I will not say that again, was so distressed about the accomplishments and scope of the then existent writers that he complained into his papyrus, "Would I had phrases that are not known, utterances that are strange, in new language that has not been used, free from repetition, not an utterance that has grown stale, which men of old had spoken." So if everything to this poor Egyptian scribe 4,000 years ago was already just repetition, how can contemporary artists and creators today possibly hope to create something new? The answer has been the same since antiquity, and it is the original use of other people's works, or in a word, imitation. So this idea of imitation has played a massive role within the development of Western art and our acceptance of what makes works of art great. I want to offer a brief overview of the evolution of imitation and originality in the main phases of Western art, where we are at today, and how a knowledge of this use of imitation improves our ability to be an engaged audience as we're able to speak the language of our artistic traditions. So the concept and discussion of imitation in art begins primarily in Greece with Plato. He proposed that everything that we see and engage with on earth is based on a perfect form that exists either in heaven or within our philosophical minds. So this desk is an imitation of a capital D amazing desk, or an ideal desk that exists somewhere beyond our comprehension. And so Plato argued that the act of artistic creation is the act of imitation in and of itself, because artists observe the world around them and then seek to imitate the objects and experiences as they capture and depict the world around them. And this idea was furthered by a philosopher named Dionysius of Halicarnassus in the 1st century, who coined it imitatio, or the idea that the creative process should be based on the close imitation of the masterpieces of preceding master artists. So this isn't to say that he recommended copying works, and never creating anything new. Rather, he described imitatio as the practice of emulating, adapting, reworking, and enriching a source text or a piece of art by an earlier author. Petrarch also dealt and sought to address this same issue. And he stated, "An imitator must take care to write something similar, yet not identical to the original. And that similarity must not be like the image to its original in painting, where the greater the similarity, the greater the praise for the artist, but rather like that of a son to his father. While often very different in their individual features, they have a certain something our painters call an air, especially noticeable about the face and eyes, that produces a resemblance. Seeing the son's face, we are reminded of the father's, although if it came to measurement, the features would all be different, but there is something subtle that creates this effect. We must thus see to it that if there is something similar, there is also a great deal that is dissimilar, and that the similar must be elusive and unable to be extricated except in silent meditation, for the resemblance is to be felt rather than expressed. Thus we may appropriate another's ideas as well as his coloring, but we must abstain from his actual words. For with the former, resemblance remains hidden, and with the latter, it is glaring. The former creates poets, the second apes." So lots of words, but essentially we want to capture the influence of these great artists who have come before, rather than simply trying to copy the work itself, because there's no added value in that. There's really no point in being an artist if you're just going to completely replicate the art that's already existed. But this idea has had a massive influence on Western culture and the arts, and especially the Renaissance. So during the Renaissance period, imitation was seen as a means of obtaining one's personal style. The Italian artist Cennino Cennini wrote a book in the 15th century titled Libro dell'arte, which became a defining handbook for Renaissance artists. He stated that the intellect benefits from this manual act of copying because it is thus provided with the standards by which it can exercise judgment. Cennini advises the artist to copy from nature once he has acquired judgment by internalizing the standards of good art. And once he has internalized these standards of good art, the artist may then proceed to investigate the three-dimensional world and go out and try to capture models or images from nature. So Cennini is a perfect example of this, and he was heavily influenced by Giotti and Giotto, and he sought to emulate them and their influences in his works. And we can kind of see that here with his beautified bishop and beautified pope, as he's obviously using the gold that is very indicative of the early Renaissance artists. But he's also seeking to capture the naturalism within their faces. But with this being the very early Renaissance, we still see a lot of the medieval influences with the weird proportions and kind of green coloring. So the emphasis on the development of originality shifted in the 18th century as we entered Romanticism. It's driving me crazy. Okay, there we go. From the middle of the 18th century to the present time, original has been increasingly accepted as synonymous with different. And Rousseau is one of the huge influences that kind of brings us from neoclassicism into Romanticism. And in his Confessions, book 1, he wrote, "I am not made like any of those I have seen. I venture to believe that I am not made like any of those who are in existence. If I am not better, at least I am different." And while it's very, like kind of hoity-toity, I think this is the perfect representation of this new approach to art through Romanticism. And Romanticism, as we all know, is characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism of the artist, as well as the glorification of the past and nature, kind of hearkening back to the emotions that we start to see in the Renaissance period versus the classical and the neoclassical. So this, again, shifted in the 20th century with modernism and postmodernism. So as we have sought to make sense of our world and society, many of our artists have turned to imitation at a completely new level, using explicit copying and appropriation of images to critique our culture. And it's, to the point where we have Duchamp's fountain that he had absolutely nothing to do with other than signing his false name. And I think this is just a representation of how, as a culture and as we've dealt with the chaos of the 20th and the 21st century, we're seeking to figure out what's new, right? What can we present that hasn't already been presented? We're facing and dealing with these issues that it feels like nobody has ever dealt with before. And I think it's so interesting to see the way that we have turned back to this really expressive, but also cookie cutter form of art and representation of our culture. And I want to argue that this new use of appropriation and of explicit imitation provides a new take on art and the issues that are facing us, and it deepens the message that the artist is trying to use. So in addition to providing information about cultures, studying art history allows people to experience deep emotional communication through the medium of visual media. And I found an article published in the Frontiers in Psychology journal, and it stated that found that compared to listening to music, looking at painting was associated with increased frequency of wonder. Participants with visual arts education reported increased vitality-related emotions in their experience of looking at painting. So there's something about this visual medium that allows us to connect with it on a completely different level. As we're bringing our own experiences and our own emotions to the table, and we're interacting with whatever the artist has, their own emotions and their own perceptions of the world around them. When those meet, it allows us to have a really deep connection with the pieces. And I think that this can be demonstrated in Guillermo del Toro's film Pan's Labyrinth. So Pan's Labyrinth, it's rated R for a reason. I'm not necessarily recommending it. Like, you do you. I'm not condoning it. But it's also an extremely beautiful movie, and I think it's fascinating to see how many references there are to Spanish art and Spanish tradition. So just a little bit of background on the film. Pan's Labyrinth is set during the Spanish Civil War, and it's a fusion of many different influences and was intended to serve not only as a beautiful story, but also as a demonstration of the rich history and the art in Spain. And Del Toro created monsters and shots reminiscent of the great works of Goya, an artist who painted the horrors and atrocities that followed the political upheaval in Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. And this connection, I think, adds deeper meaning and new implications to Del Toro's masterpiece, which demonstrates his mastery of the craft, but also shows his recognition of these great traditions within Western art. My favorite example is Goya's Saturn devouring his son, and then the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth. And there's a couple of scenes where like this pale man, he bites the head off of a fairy, and like he's in this position, like almost exactly like the painting. And there's also some visual similarities that I really love. Let's see if it works. Okay, yeah. So we have like here, we're seeing this depiction of Saturn at his most dehumanized, as he is devouring his own child. He's completely lost any sense of, what makes him human. And he still has this humanoid figure, right? We see the head, the arms, he's humanoid. But we can see like with the lighting, I'll just use the mouse so people on Zoom can see it. His flesh is like, it's almost melting off of his bones. Like there's just sagging. And it's really horrifying. And we just see him at this like peak, I guess, of where he's at his worst. I think this is reflected very clearly here. Just this similar like horrifying element, this humanoid figure is completely lost whatever it was that made him like this in the past. And yeah, it's just sagging. And I think also the connections that he makes to Goya throughout the film add beauty as we're looking back at the chaos when Napoleon invaded Spain that Goya was responding to in his works. And we see Del Toro connecting that time frame and that kind of collective shared memory and trauma with the Spanish Civil War. So just to conclude, I know it's kind of short today, but I think, as we're facing this new era of art history, it's really hard to define like where we are and what this movement looks like, especially since we're living in it. And I guess I'm just really curious to see what happens, because I mean it feels like we've had, we are constantly going through a pendulum, where we're looking at more classical works, everything is, strict, everything fits within these very specific parameters. And then we move to Romanticism, where it's all about emotion and individuality. And now we're, and then in the 20th century, as we saw, it's very removed, I think, as we're trying to deal with the chaos of our culture. And I can't help but wonder, what is this new era of postmodern art look like? What are we going to focus on? And I think, you know, as I'm not to sound cheesy, but as like, you know, the new up and coming generation, I think we have a lot of control over what we want the art world that we're facing, you know, to look like. And I guess just consider, you know, how can we apply the lessons and the great traditions of the past with the new issues and the new scenarios that we're facing.